Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks so much for PTAC to have me back here. This is my third update, I think, on this research project. 4 years ago, I think, we started in the Northeast Boreal Forest trying to find a few things out about white-tailed deer populations there. So we know that white-tailed deer populations are expanding in the Boreal Forest. They're a natural native component to that ecosystem, but they've historically occurred in very low, regular numbers until the last decade to maybe a little bit more than that, where there's been an obvious increase. It's been very difficult to get a handle on the magnitude of that increase and the mechanisms of that increase. Deer are notoriously difficult to survey in the Boreal Forest because of all the conifer cover. Speaking as someone who had to spend a lot of time doing ungulate surveys, you end up with very big confidence intervals on surveys where most of your animals are hiding underneath trees and you can't see them. So we set about using some novel techniques on the ground to try to estimate white-tailed deer densities using a combination of camera traps and satellite collars. And in the course of doing this, we are able to extract a lot of that data, especially the camera data, and test a few hypotheses about the mechanisms of white-tailed deer expansion and distribution in the Northeast Boreal Forest. We're on the final year of that project right now. So what I'm going to present on is, at first, a refresher on the white-tailed deer situation. For those of you who were here last year and have better memories than mine, please bear with me. For those of you who are new, it'll be an important piece of information. And then I'm going to go on and talk about some of the work we've done on examining the distribution of white-tailed deer reproductive success in the Boreal Forest. In other words, are deer having a lot more kids in different parts of the forest than in others? And I'm the head of the team, but there's a whole suite of people that are working on this, and they're acknowledged here. And of course, we're supported generously by PTAC and by AESRD and MEG and a few others. So the issue, which Craig set up for me so beautifully, thanks for that, Craig, white-tailed deer are increasing in abundance and expanding throughout the Boreal Forest, with obvious ramifications now for woodland caribou. As you get more deer, that bolsters wolf populations. More wolves opportunistically predate upon woodland caribou and are contributing to their declines. So if you're going to try to tackle the woodland caribou problem, if you're going to go in on the diagonal, one of the things you can try to tackle is the white-tailed deer problem. And one of the possible management approaches that might be considered is the reduction of white-tailed deer populations. How far do those need to be reduced? And do we also need to some way manage the footprint on the landscape in order to try to keep those white-tailed deer populations down? Now, there's a couple of competing hypotheses around white-tailed deer expansion, and the first is that human activities on the land base promote deer expansion, basically by knocking down all that old, mature forest that's not much use to deer and replacing it with young, juicy, beautiful, early cereal vegetation. And of course, by unmixing the mixed wood, so reducing the amount of conifer and increasing the amount of deciduous, which is also better for deer. If you have more food, you have better nutrition, you have lower mortality, and critically, you also have increased reproduction, which is going to be a focus of the talk today. The other competing hypothesis, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but somewhat different, is that climate change promotes deer expansion. So through a longer growing season, decreased winter severity, and you have lower overwinter mortality. So some work that was previously done by Stan Booten's group and Kim Daw suggested that a lot of the blame for deer expansion could be thrown into the lap of climate change. Because you get reduced overwinter mortality, that was allowing deer to gain a foothold in the Boreal Forest and expand. But that was based on a lot of modeling exercises. There wasn't a lot of data available at the time to examine this question more in depth. We have that data now, so we're examining it more in depth. So our approach is that we're modeling deer distribution in relation to natural and anthropogenic landscape features using, as I mentioned before, camera traps. So camera traps are this great, cheap technology that can be used across really large areas over long periods of time, and they provide serial detection or non-detection data across space and through time. So is the deer present at a point in time, or is it not present at a point in time? And it's that second part that's really critical, because you can't get that information from telemetry data. right? To get telemetry data, the deer has to be there in the first place to wear the collar. The great thing about cams is that you can see those holes in the landscape where deer are definitely not, and then compare those areas through statistical modeling. So for our design, we deployed 60 Reconyx hyperfire cameras, those are the Cadillacs, on wildlife trails in a random stratified design across the northeast boreal forest from just north of the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range all the way up to Bond Lakes up here. Each of these black dots represents one of our camera stations. We deployed those in October 2011, and we've been running them right up until the beginning of this month. So we've got this continuous 3-year data set on deer occurrence and non-occurrence throughout that entire study area. So we took this continuous data set and we divided up into monthly surveys and analyzed data among 3-month seasons. And I presented a bunch of work last year to justify why we did that, and we showed that it works really well. And we showed that we actually have a 99.9% probability of detecting a deer when a deer is present. So conversely, we are only missing deer 0.1% of the time where they occur. So we have a lot of confidence in these camera data in surveying the distribution of deer across the landscape. We were constrained to roads because we did not have helicopter access readily available at the time. We've done a whole bunch of background work to show that this did not create a bias in our sampling because we're not sampling the habitat tight around each circle. We're sampling the habitat in these models at a 3-kilometer radius around each point. So when you do the math on that, it actually encompasses a whole bunch of non-roaded areas, roaded areas, and that's equal across the entire study area. So we're also very confident in our design. The problem with camera traps, as I've said before, is that you don't always get the animal that you're looking for, even if it's present. So say, for instance, you put your camera out and you get a nice foggy picture like this. In 1 month, another month goes by, there's still no deer. 3rd month, and you get a beautiful moose shot, it's still not a deer. If you stopped at this point in time, you would say that's a deer absent site. If you kept on 1 more month, deer show up and suddenly becomes a deer present site. So instead of treating these data as no deer there, yes deer there, far better to create a probability of occurrence of deer. So we used a new modeling approach called Occupancy Models, which basically does that. So it takes that detection history of no deer, no deer, no deer, deer, and then it runs through a series of probabilities and finds a best fit model to say what is the probability that a deer is at this point in space at this point in time, and at sites where you did not see any deer throughout your entire sampling history, what is the probability that there's one there that we missed? And as I said, we've run through the math and we're really confident in these data, and all that report is available to anybody who's interested. Just email me. So using this modeling approach basically cuts the data into different layers so we can estimate the probability of deer detection, as I've talked about, then the probability that the deer is actually at the site. And when you run this for several years, you can estimate the probability that a deer will colonize an empty site at some point throughout that sampling period. The probability that an occupied site becomes extinct, meaning that there was a deer there but then it's gone, and then you put all these parameters together to calculate a spatial growth rate for your entire study area. In other words, the rate at which that distribution, not population, the distribution contracts or expands through time, and how it does that through time. So last year, I presented on the nuts and bolts of this analysis, and this is basically the final conclusion. So what we have here is the time scale from last year's data. I just had 2 years worth of data to work with here so far. We're still analyzing the final year. So October to December 2011 through to April, June of 2013. And this is that estimated spatial expansion parameter right here. So 1 is that dashed line. If your occupancy stays exactly even, so that population stays consistent throughout the entire sampling period, that parameter will be 1. If the population is expanding, it'll be more than 1. If it's contracting, it'll be less than 1. The black line here is actually the probability of deer occupancy at a site, and then the green line is the estimated degree to which the population is contracting or expanding. So as you can see, when we started this thing in October 2011, occupancy was right here at 1. So basically every single site across that landscape had white-tailed deer at it. That dropped throughout that first winter, which, if you recall, the winter of 2012 was a really nice winter. It was quite moderate, not a lot of snow, not a lot of cold, but there was still a little bit of contraction of that population representing overwinter mortality. But then it bounced back up throughout the spring, summer periods, and then in that second winter, if you recall, the winter of 2013 was absolutely miserable, right? There was snow, there was lots of icing events, it was extreme cold, and that distribution shrank to almost half of the steady area. But critically, it rebounded again really fast. And if you look at the rate of spatial growth, come the spring, that first spring after the moderate winter, the population, the distribution was expanding by 20%, but the bounce back was upwards at 80%. So what's this telling us is that, yep, there's overwinter mortality and severe winters that you don't see in the nicer ones we're getting lately, but the bounce back of that deer distribution is profound and it is immediate. So in other words, the deer are automatically refilling all of the empty spaces created from overwinter mortality. Now, the question before us, I'll get to in the next slide because I don't want to preempt myself. So from previous work, we concluded that, yep, severe winters reduce white-tailed deer occupancy for sure, but site colonization after a decrease is extremely rapid. It happens in the next season. White-tailed deer distribution continued to expand throughout this steady period, and when we did some species habitat modeling on this, we found that it was anthropogenic footprint and the amount of upland deciduous forest in that landscape that best explained deer occurrence in the northeast boreal. So natural habitat is having an effect, but the effect of anthropogenic footprint, particularly linear features, was a very strong predictor of deer occurrence. So the more linear features in the landscape, the more deer you were likely to have at a site, and for longer. So the question before us then became, all right, so if deer are recolonizing those landscapes fairly quickly, is that just existing deer taking advantage of now empty spots to go and set up camp for the summertime, or is there a component of reproduction to this? In other words, are we just recycling the same deer and dwindling in population size, but deer are just moving around and becoming more spaced, or is there a lot of reproductive success in this landscape? Well, that's another beautiful thing about camera data, is that every time a deer comes by the camera, you can see if it's a mom with a couple of fawns, or if it's just a singleton. And so we get some information on reproductive success, which very simply defined here is the probability that a doe will be attended by fawns or young of the year. Okay? So if it has a youngster with it, we're terming that reproductive success. Again, the problem with camera data is that if you just photograph a singleton, you're not entirely sure if the fawns are just offside your picture or not, and so you're always underrepresenting the number of fawns. But we can run exactly that same detectability analysis, basically adding another layer to that layer cake, and look at the probability of detecting fawns where they occur. And again, we're sitting up around 90 to 95% sure that we are detecting fawns wherever they occur throughout this landscape. So again, we have a lot of confidence in this data, so we can estimate not only the probability of deer occurrence, but the probability of occurrence of reproductively successful females. So we did this successfully for grizzly bears for one of the first times, just published in Conservation Biology. We took that tech and we brought it to the deer question. So, and the results we found are this. So this is our first kick at the cat. So what we did is we went to see if whether or not the reproductive success differed across different natural landscape types before we started investigating the effect, if any, of anthropogenic features. So we've got conifer stands here, mixed woods, conifer, deciduous, and mixed wood stands. And then on this axis here is the probability of occurrence of just straight up deer in red, and then the probability of reproductive success in the blue. So as you can see, for fall 2011, right up here, and we're moving on. So before that moderate winter, there was deer everywhere across that landscape, as I've said before. The probability of reproductive success was only about 50% in conifer stands, but it was pretty close to 100% in deciduous and mixed wood stands, which means that every single one of those sites had a female with young of the year in fall. at it. So reproductive success was very widespread. In the spring of 2012, which is the spring following that moderate winter, the picture doesn't change very much. So you're getting a little bit more reproduction. These would be true fawns now in the conifer stands. But again, the reproductive success was 100% in deciduous and mixed wood stands. Every single one of those sites had a successful reproduction at it, which is very, very significant. Jumping ahead now to fall 2012, before the big freeze, the probability of occurrence of deer generally was actually lower, so it was only about 80% in conifer, but still close to 100% in deciduous and mixed wood. And you look at the blue dots, again, the probability of fawns, again, lower in conifer, but still pretty close to 100% in deciduous and mixed wood. Now the kicker is the spring 2013 data, which is the last piece of data we have. As I said, we just collected the last of the camera data and we're working it up. So for the data at hand, this is the spring following that really killer winter. We would expect to see not a whole lot of reproduction, right? If it's hard on numbers, it's going to be hard on reproduction as well. And what we found was that reproduction success was lower in conifer stands than in previous time periods, and it was lower in mixed wood stands, but in those deciduous stands, every single one of those deciduous stands still had a reproductively successful female within it. So this tells us that even in severe winters with big overwinter mortality, if you make it through that winter time, you're still cranking out a kid, and those kids are everywhere. So we believe this is a strong signal that reproductive success in that landscape is contributing towards the expansion of white-tailed deer. And we're going to tease these data and parse them apart a bit more and look at the effect of any of anthropogenic features. But right now the data is pretty tight that there's a lot more reproductive success in that landscape than we think there is, even after a severe winter. So fawning rates do vary with at least natural landscape features so far. So far we didn't detect any influence of anthropogenic features, but again, this is a first kick. And deciduous stands supported really high reproductive success, which is bad news because we're creating a lot more deciduous stands than we are conifer. So the second question we looked at is starting to make use of that extensive telemetry data that we collected over the last couple of years. So we've collared 40 female white-tailed deer does with satellite collars that obtain 2-hour locations. We've had them collared from spring 2012 through to present, and like Craig said, collars blink in and out, some malfunction. A lot of our deer died, especially in the severe winter, but we've got a data set on 40 individuals. And one of the first things we're starting to look at is dispersal movements, right? So if deer are expanding in the forest, you would expect that not only populations are increasing, but that individuals are moving farther than you might expect. So we asked that question of female white-tailed deer. We're still in the midst of that analysis, so I'm going to show you as preliminary, but it's still interesting, I think. So we calculated 95% minimum convex polygon home ranges for all of our deer. So these are all our deer individuals across the bottom, and this is home range size in that MCP. So most of the deer right here, this section, they stayed pretty much close to home, exactly as you expect female white-tailed deer to do, but there was that component of the population right up here, this 8 or so individuals that made really big movements. So one of these females had a home range loosely described, around 800 square kilometers. Others were up around 600, 200, etc. Some of these individuals moved clear from sort of the far west side of our study area all the way through to western Saskatchewan, and then took up residence there. So some of these females are making really large movements, and our preliminary analysis shows that the rates of female dispersal movements, these long-distance movements, are radically higher than what is seen in the rest of the literature for white-tailed deer elsewhere. So Alberta whitetails seem to be boogieing a whole lot more than whitetails in other parts of the country. Preliminary. The next thing we're doing is we're examining daily movements of deer and asking, are the things we're doing on the landscape influencing some of these long-distance movements? So because we have these 2-hour slices of movement through time, we can estimate step length for each of these 2-hour pieces, calculate mean step lengths for each of these deer and plot them through time. So this right here is January of the calendar year through to the end of the calendar year, and we've got, as I said, about 2.5 years of data through here. So as you would expect, deer movement is basically minimal in the winter period when they're yarding up, and then the step lengths really start to take off, and they're making some substantially larger movements per step throughout the summer and the fall, and decreasing through to back again in the winter time. So we're taking that information, we're using right now step selection functions. So say for instance we've got Maybelle here with her collar on. This right here is Maybelle's entire location history throughout that 2.5 year period. This is actually the one that started off at Winifred and then ended up over here in Saskatchewan. Sorry for no scale bar. So what we can do is we can look at each of these steps, the actual steps, and compare them to a series of simulated steps, which is what each of these different blue little lengths are. And we can say, did the deer move in this distance in this direction? Is that statistically correlated to, say, the presence of a linear feature or the existence of a riparian area or something like that, compared to all the possible steps that the deer could have taken? Are they selecting different features for different steps? So at the end of this analysis, we're hoping to be able to say something about whether or not what we're doing in the landscape is actually allowing deer to move farther than they do in other places. Work in progress. Come see me at the end of March. And then graphically, this is what this looks like. So this is this really ugly mess, but we basically have a series of locations with true steps and then all these simulated steps, and we can overlay them on a GIS map and analyze some of those movements. So we're working on that now. Now, getting back to our initial core objective, which is white-tailed deer density estimation. Why is this so important? So if you're going to use cameras to estimate white-tailed deer density, people have been trying this for a long time and failing at it because, not just for deer, but for other species, because it's very difficult for an unmarked animal, and like a deer, most deer look pretty much the same unless you got a big, beautiful stag. It's difficult to tell a whole bunch of deer crossing once across your camera or one deer crossing a whole bunch of times back and forth across your camera. But we can get around this by estimating the probability of an individual's deer movement in front of a camera. So previous models exist to do this by just coming up with some sort of probability density of movement and saying, I think the deer moves this much, and we're going to use that to translate occupancy data into density. So what we're doing is we're taking actual individual movements, measuring that, seeing how often an individual deer crosses back and forth in front of a camera, and extrapolating that to the population to estimate white-tailed deer density. And this has been done successfully for jaguars, for black bears, and for wolverines, and so we're the first to try it on ungulates. But we believe that when we're done at the back end, we're going to have a fairly reliable and ultimately cheaply implemented tool that will allow us to estimate white-tailed deer densities. Once we have an idea of those densities, that will be some basis for management, so we can examine something like herd management as an additional prong of the attack on trying to mitigate woodland caribou. And with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions and thank PTAC very, very much for their support of this project, without which it would not have been possible. So thanks.